This video is brought to you by Squarespace, the all-in-one website platform. More on them later in this video. Welcome back to Geographics. I'm your host, Cosmic Horror Madman Eric Malachite, and today we're talking about Big Ben, with a script penned by the ever-factual Larry Holsworth. If Larry has provided links, they'll be right alongside links to my storytelling deep dive channel, Story Rant, my books, and more. With that said, let's dive into it. In the worlds of motion pictures and advertising, there is a technique known as the establishing shot. The term refers to an image which will immediately allow the viewer to establish in their mind the location being depicted. A shot of the Eiffel Tower immediately conveys to the viewer that the scene is in Paris. The onion domes of the Kremlin establish the action as being set in Moscow, and a lingering shot of a fistfight in a Walmart parking lot will of course let people know that yes, we're in Florida. Similarly, the image of a tall, dignified, and historic clock tower, part of the Palace of Westminster, depicts the City of London, symbolizing the heart of the British Empire in bygone days, and the British government today. The clock tower was completed in 1859 and has been known by many names, some official, some not so official, but easily the most well-known is among the simplest and most illustrative: Big Ben, a fitting name for what is essentially a massive clock. Now, technically, because we know someone will correct us on this one, the name Big Ben refers to the bell inside of the tower, but we can get to that in a moment. First, let's talk about how the City of London ended up sporting the architectural equivalent of a Rolex, and it starts with, of all things, a fire. You see, in 1834, the Palace of Westminster, the seat of the British government, was largely destroyed by a massive fire, known as the Great Fire of 1834, and not to be confused with the Great Fire of London, which was another massive fire that resulted in great swaths of London being destroyed. A story for another day, we're sure. The blaze began when the disposal of some old sticks went terribly, disastrously wrong. The short version is a government clerk was tasked with disposing of a bunch of old tally sticks, an outdated method of record keeping where information was literally written on a stick. And rather than give them away or just toss them in the Thames, as was standard practice back then, opted to burn them. The problem was the place he told laborers to burn them was a coal fire, designed to burn coal, not wood, located beneath the House of Lords. What difference does that make, you ask? Well, that's probably what the clerk thought right before the Houses of Parliament caught fire. For anybody who is actually curious about this, the problem lies in the way wood burns as opposed to coal, with coal admittedly giving off more heat, but less flame. And it's these flames which were able to escape the confines of the furnace and spread, the end result being basically the total and complete destruction of Westminster. But out of these ashes would rise a phoenix, or at least a massive clock. In 1836, the government decided to do something about the symbolic seat of British political power being a literal derelict burned out wreck instead of a metaphorical one, and invited architects from across the land to submit ideas to build upon the ruins. To ensure the final decision was ironically given the project free from any politics, architects had to submit their plans anonymously, signing their work with a symbol or pseudonym rather than their name. Of 97 pitches, the commission in charge of the project chose number 62, identified by the symbol of a portcullis, the chosen pseudonym of British architect Charles Barry. Barry's submission prevailed in part because he incorporated the surviving structures of the old palace into the new one. Now, it's worth noting that Barry had some guidelines for his pitch, with the commission dictating that any submitted design should be in the Gothic or Elizabethan style. Apparently, there were plans to ape the neoclassical style of the White House, but seeing as that style was synonymous with revolution and Britain being told to suck it, they opted for one that was more traditional. America. Getting back to Barry, he collaborated with Auguste Pugin, the son of a French draftsman who had fled to England during the French Revolution. Pugin, like Barry, favored the Gothic style. Together, the architects laid out a plan in which the rebuilt palace would take the shape of a rectangle, roughly parallel to the River Thames, with two towers at opposite ends of the structure. The design underwent numerous changes and modifications during construction, including the addition of a third central tower. The two towers of the original design were completed, though much taller than originally planned, and designated simply the clock tower on the north axis of the building and the Victoria Tower opposite on the southern axis. with the latter being named for the monarch at the time, Queen Victoria, and the former for the big-ass clock and chimes it was to contain, which, while accurate, is a little disappointing, and only reaffirms how correct everyone is for giving the South Tower a fun nickname. Now, construction of the palace was notably problematic. The architect's partnership was anything but harmonious, and conflicts also arose with builders, suppliers, and members of parliament. Pugin came to regard the building with thinly veiled contempt, referring to it as Tudor details on a classic body. In 1852, Pugin, whose works included numerous now classic buildings in Britain, suffered a mental breakdown, and after several failed attempts at treatment was confined to the Royal Bethlehem Hospital, known in the vernacular as Bedlam. He died there in September 1852. Before his descent into madness and eventual death, Pugin had completed the final design of what became the clock tower. The design was delivered to Barry in 1843 and modified during construction to increase its height and ornamentation. Construction of the clock tower began in late 1843 and was deemed complete in 1859. The tower is 12.2 meters square at its base, rises to a total height of 96.3 meters, and is topped with a tile roof, the tiles being of cast iron. 3 separate staircases, each of stone, rise within the tower. The first, a flight of 290 steps, leads to the clock room. A second flight of 44 steps reaches the belfry, and a final staircase of 65 steps must be surmounted to reach the top of the tower at its spire. If you want your brand to be as recognizable as Big Ben, you're going to need a snazzy and stylish website. Well, Squarespace might be just what you're looking for. Squarespace is the all-in-one website platform, perfect for entrepreneurs selling knockoff Big Ben alarm clocks to the masses. And Squarespace has all the tools you need to get the job done right, all in one place and on your terms. With Squarespace's next-generation website engine, the Fluid Engine, you'll be able to choose from a template and customize it to your heart's content. And best of all, your website will be fully functional on desktop and mobile from the get-go. And if you're excited about SEO and AI tools, Squarespace Blueprint has you covered. You'll be able to choose from professionally curated layouts and styling options to build a unique online presence from the ground up. And you'll be able to make sure your website hits all those SEO sweet spots, ensuring you reach the right people to grow your audience the way you want. Best of all though, if you are selling Big Ben replicas on your site, Squarespace makes it easier than ever before to make the checkout process seamless for your customers with simple yet powerful payment tools. Accept credit cards, PayPal, Apple Pay, and in eligible countries, your customers can even opt to buy now and pay later with Afterpay and ClearPay. Ready to get started? Check out squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/geographics to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Now back to Big Ben. Entirely mechanical and wound by hand even to this day, the clock within Big Ben is an engineering marvel in every sense of the term. So let's break it down. Starting with the dials for the 4 clock faces, they were designed by Pugin, manufactured of cast iron sections, bolted together and finished in Prussian blue, something we actually didn't know about until relatively recently, with experts in charge of helping restore Big Ben around the late 2010s discovering this fact halfway through printing the dials and hands black. Whoops. As for the face behind the dials, this was made of blown glass. Pugin eschewed the common practice in clockmaking of presenting the numeral 4 as 4 tally marks, replacing it with a more proper numeral IV for 4, and beneath each dial included the Latin, which I will do my best to pronounce, Domine Salvum Fac Reginam Nostram Victoriam Primam, meaning Lord save our Queen Victoria first. The 4-hour hands are manufactured of gunmetal, an alloy similar to bronze, while the longer minute hands are of a much lighter material, namely copper. The hour hands are 2.7 meters in length, while the minute hands are 4.2 meters long. Both are built with counterweights, balancing the hands at their pivot points, which allow the clock mechanism to drive them smoothly around the dials. The minute hands, including the counterweights, weigh approximately 100 kilograms apiece, while the shorter hour hands weigh in at roughly 300 kilograms, including the counterweights. Now, contrary to what you'd expect, given their colossal size, the mechanism driving these massive hands is very sensitive and can be impacted by everything from inclement weather to a bird deciding to take a shit on one of them, both of which have actually happened, and we're delighted to talk about them in detail right now. So, in regards to weather, the clock has been slowed many times by extremes in temperature, but perhaps the most notable example of Big Ben being unable to take the heat, or in this case, the lack thereof, occurred in 1962 when a large buildup of snow caused the hands to slow, resulting in London ringing in the new year 10 minutes late. On other occasions, the clock has both been slowed and stopped outright by extreme heat. In regards to birds, these are largely deemed to be more of a nuisance than a threat to the clock, with London's hardiest and most patriotic pigeons frequently resting upon it. However, owing to the fact Big Ben bing bongs with literal clockwork regularity each and every hour, the problem usually fixes itself, though the mess left by the birds does need to be periodically scrubbed away. However, there was one occasion in 1949 where a flock of starlings made a nest on one of the hands. So many starlings, in fact, that the clock was slowed by almost 5 whole minutes, prompting a bemused and presumably very annoyed engineer to have to go out and shoo the birds away. This particular story was gleefully reported in the press, and much attention was drawn to the fact that Big Ben had recently withstood the might of the Nazi war machine, dutifully keeping time throughout the war with almost perfect accuracy, only for a flock of birds to swoop in and literally crap up the mechanism. Speaking of which, to drive the hands around the dials, a clock movement was designed, somewhat surprisingly, by an amateur horologist, one who studies the mechanical measure of time, by the name of Edmund Beckett. Beckett was a lawyer by profession, a horologist by hobby, but in the latter, a widely respected one. He enlisted the assistance of George Airy, then royal astronomer, in completing the design, which was then submitted to clockmakers for bids for its construction. E.J. Dent was a London clockmaker and watchmaker with a reputation for manufacturing highly accurate clocks and marine chronometers. His firm was well known to George Airy, who helped steer the contract for the Palace of Westminster's clock to them, though the firm's founder, Edward John Dent, died before the clock could be completed. Dent's son, Frederick Ripon Dent, took on the task of completing the amateur design movement in 1853 and delivered the finished clock in early 1854. At the time, the clock room of the tower was incomplete, and since it could not be installed, Dent took advantage of the delay by experimenting with the new mechanism. Dent made several modifications of a technical nature, and since Beckett had not patented his design, strange for a lawyer, Dent's adjustments were accepted by the industry as his own. Without going into too much technical detail, as clock mechanisms are intricate, complex devices, Dent's improvements to Beckett's movement were adopted as standards for both large clocks and smaller timepieces. To adjust the speed of the movement of mechanical clocks, one must adjust the travel distance of the pendulum, or the length the pendulum travels in each swing. In his design, Beckett provided for the addition or removal of weight to the pendulum to slightly alter the length of the swing. Now, given the sheer size of the clock, you're probably picturing a giant-ass weight the size of a small car or something. But remember, this is a mechanism that can be slowed or stopped by a small amount of snow or an unreasonable number of birds. It's very sensitive. So sensitive, in fact, that adjustments were and still are made by adding or removing a single penny from the mechanism. With each altering the speed, the clock ticks by 4/10 of a second, since the addition or removal of a coin alters the mass of the pendulum by a pennyweight. Beckett divided the operation of the clock into 3 sections, or trains. The first, the going train, moves the hands across the dial. The second, chiming train, is triggered by the going train when the hands reach a predetermined point, and triggers the chimes. The striking chain, also triggered by the going train, operates the hammer for striking Big Ben, as well as the lesser bells. All derive their energy from the descent of weights in the tower, balanced against the tension stored in the main spring. The speed of the pendulum controls the manner that the clock measures seconds of time, and it also controls the speed by which the clock's mainspring is gradually unwound. As the spring unwinds, it reaches the point when it requires rewinding, a process conducted then, as now, by hand. As you've probably gathered by now, this is easier than you'd expect given the size of the mechanism, with a video we found showing a man seeming to be in his mid-60s turning the necessary crank with minimal effort. This ease comes with a downside though, that being that this cranking process takes about 90 minutes and needs to be done 3 times a week. Prior to the clock's installation in the tower, its accuracy was determined to be within a few seconds per week. Once installed and thus subject to changes in temperature, humidity, and, yes, bird density, the clock required, and still requires, constant monitoring to ensure its mechanism is in sync with the passage of time, as measured by the heavens. Something we should note is that while a lot of the maintenance of Big Ben is done by hand and using the same methods engineers did hundreds of years ago, computers are used to ensure accuracy. For example, while the pennies are still used to adjust the mechanism, the amount of pennies placed upon it is partly determined using computer software alongside an engineer's own discretion. The clock was installed in the clock room of the tower upon its completion in 1859, to ensure its four faces were visible at night and in the well-known gloom of London's weather. Its four faces were backlit with gas lamps. To call Londoners' attention more forcibly to the clock, it was configured to chime the hours and the quarter hours throughout the day and night. The chimes required the completion of the belfry above the clock room, and the installation of 5 bells, 4 to chime the quarters, and 1 to intone the change of the hour. Beckett had designed his clock as both a mechanism for keeping time and one for initiating a sequence of bell strikes, announcing the time for those within earshot. Given that the bell's chimes clock in at around 118 decibels, enough to cause anyone nearby physical pain from sound alone, within earshot is anyone less than 5 miles away. For the hour, the most important of the bells as regards keeping time, Beckett had called for a massive bell just under 14 metric tons. A bell that size could hardly swing in a belfry. Instead, it was designed to be struck by a hammer, driven by the clock mechanism, which activated a spring and pulley system when appropriate. The first bell was cast by the firm of John Warner and Sons and delivered in 1856. Since the tower was not ready to receive it, the bell was installed in the new palace yard, where it was tolled for testing. Testing that was very much required, since upon being struck, the bell immediately and irreparably cracked. In April 1858, a new bell was cast at Whitechapel Bell Foundry in London's district of that name. Of note is that 1 century earlier, the Whitechapel Bell Foundry had cast the Liberty Bell, the famously cracked giant bell. Presumably, officials were banking on the fact that the foundry had improved since then and that fate didn't have a sense of humor. So it was in early summer 1859 that the bell was installed. The clock itself was initiated in May, before the new bell arrived. Now, installed is kind of underselling things here, because we're talking about an object that weighs almost 14 tons, roughly the weight of 2 fully grown elephants, and needed to be moved by hand. Well, hand, horse, and mule, all of which worked in tandem to hoist the bell into position 60 meters above the ground. And to great anticipation of the assembled crowds gathered for the purpose of hearing its tone, struck by its hammer on July 11th, 1859. It cracked. As for how this bell cracked, that was because Beckett insisted on a hammer double the size of what was necessary, and it simply couldn't deal with the repeated stress of being struck, literally cracking under the pressure. Rather than attempt a third casting of the bell, the existing bell was repaired by patching a portion of the crack along the rim of the bell. It was then rotated 1/4 turn in the belfry in relation to the hammer so that further strikes would not be upon the existing damage. A new hammer was fashioned and installed, lighter than its predecessor, of course. The changes meant that the bell, when sounded, is no longer an E natural tone, though it is still designated as such. It is slightly flatter than E natural upon striking, but it resonates near the natural tone so as not to create disharmony with its lesser fellows in the belfry. The repairs took more than 3 years, during which time the hour was struck on the third of the smaller bells, which also sounds a natural E, though in an octave below that of Big Ben. According to some, the bell was to have been named Victoria, in honor of the Queen, though there is little evidence to support the assertion, and the potential reference to the bell as Big Vicky seems somewhat disparaging.
Okay, so I helped edit this script. Karl, I'm British. That will be very funny. Big Vicky all day.
Another potential source of its name was Ben Kant, a former heavyweight boxing champion and popular hero, though he had retired from fighting several years before. A brief comeback attempt in 1857 restored his name temporarily to the public imagination, given that he fought a final bout which lasted 60 rounds before being declared a draw, but there is no hard evidence the bell was named for him. Another source of the name Big Ben came from Sir Benjamin Hall, Chief Lord of the Woods and Forests for Westminster, and evidently a bit of a blowhard, known to colleagues as Big Ben. That story is also apocryphal, and the name seems to have simply arisen of its own accord, being both descriptive and alliterative. The truth is, we simply don't know. As for the official name of the bell used by the government in reference to its operation, maintenance, and history, they call it the Great Bell. Though this isn't used in common parlance, as that's one of several nicknames given to former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson. This is a very funny joke if you're British.
that one's just funny. He is a band. I'm laughing at my own joke. So maybe you could slot that in with me just laughing like, yeah, that's funny. That's pretty good. I'm proud of that line.
The smaller bells hang in the belfry near their much larger compatriot and sound the tones of G, F sharp, E, and B. They sound the quarters of the hour, following a musical pattern known as the Westminster chimes, or Westminster quarters, and copied by churches and carillons around the world. There are several different hourly chimes played by London bell towers, including Winchester Cathedral, St. Paul's, St. Martin's in the Fields, Trinity Church, and others, but those sounded by Westminster are arguably the most famous. Until the installation of a bell named Great Paul in St. Paul's Cathedral in 1881, Big Ben, cracked and slightly out of tune, was the largest bell in the United Kingdom. Though the clock, the dials, and the tower housing them have all undergone various repairs and modifications throughout their history, Big Ben has remained unaltered since its initial repairs were completed in 1862. Even before widespread dissemination of the image of Westminster Palace's new bell tower and clock enveloped the British Empire, the accuracy of its clock was well known. In 1885, an American company called the United Clock Company was formed in Westbury, Connecticut. It later reorganized as the Western Clock Manufacturing Company, and in the first decade of the 20th century introduced a hand-wound alarm clock with twin bells mounted on the top of the case, which it called Big Ben. Big Ben alarm clocks were trademarked beginning in 1908, and 2 years later the West Clock's name appeared on the back of the case, with the name Big Ben prominently displayed on its face. In its advertising and promotional materials, West Clocks played on the colloquial name of London's famous clock. Big Ben alarm clocks were marketed all over the world, and may have been the reason so many came to associate the name with the London clock and tower, rather than simply to the massive bell which chimed the hour. West Clocks later exploited the name further with a line of smaller travel alarm clocks, which they called Baby Ben, trademarking both names, of course. Electrical versions of the clocks, which buzzed rather than rang, also followed. The Big Ben name for alarm clocks is still an active brand, though West Clocks exists as a brand name. The name Big Ben, which originated from sources unproven in London, remains a trademarked brand name in the United States, used on clocks of an entirely different nature than the original bell which bore the name. Since it entered service as a means of measuring and reporting the time of day, the clock mechanism called Big Ben has been held to stringent requirements for accuracy. It must be within 1 second of the time as measured by the Royal Observatory at Greenwich when it initiates its first hourly stroke of the day, which occurs at 12 midnight. That accuracy has been maintained over more than a century by careful maintenance of the mechanism and by adjusting the length of the pendulum travel using predecimal pennies. As mentioned, 1 penny allows for the clock to gain or lose roughly 4/10 or 2/5 of 1 second, depending on if the coin is added or removed. Britain has not minted predecimal pennies since 1970, meaning that the clock's fabled accuracy is achieved through the use of machinery designed and built more than a century and a half ago, altered in performance through the use of defunct coinage. As noted, the clock was designed primarily by an amateur, with its only flaw seemingly to have been in the casting of the bell, which was done by experienced professionals. It is truly a fascinating piece of history, and it has been a large part of history. 4 times, Big Ben has chimed to mark the passing of British monarchs during their funerals, beginning with Edward VII in 1910, when it marked the late monarch's age by chiming 68 times. It was again used in 1936 for George V, in 1952 for George VI, and most recently in 2022 for the funeral of Elizabeth II. The gas lamps backlighting the clock's faces were removed and replaced with electric lights in 1906. This was 3 years after the Ayrton light, which sits above the belfry at the top of the tower, was electrified. The Ayrton light was installed in 1885 and lit when Parliament was in session. Later, it was illuminated at night regardless of the status of Parliament. In both world wars, the Ayrton light and the clock faces were not lighted due to the threat of German bombers by Zeppelin in World War I and by the Luftwaffe in World War II. As noted, the clock itself still ticked. They just didn't advertise its location so as to give the Germans an easy target. Over its history, the Great Clock's accuracy has been challenged many times, perhaps in one exchange more British than any other. In 1930, the first Commissioner of Works was called before Parliament to answer questions regarding the clock's accuracy. The first Commissioner was asked to explain why the clock appeared to be inaccurate. John Reamer, Member of Parliament for Macclesfield, asked what steps are taken to ensure that the time given by Big Ben is correct. The Commissioner, George Lansbury, replied, "The clock is checked daily by Greenwich Observatory. During the last 290 days, the error has exceeded 1 second on 8 days only." Reamer responded by asking, "Is the right honorable gentleman satisfied in view of the fact that Big Ben is 3 minutes slow compared with every other clock in the country?" "I should say," returned Lansbury, "that all the others are wrong and Big Ben is right." The exchange was printed in Hansard, the official repository of all parliamentary debates and records. Despite such confidence in the Great Clock, it has been documented as wrong as regards the time of day on numerous occasions in its history. As mentioned, snow and ice have caused the clock to slow and even stop, the former from the accumulation on its hands, creating excessive weight, and the latter from ice infiltrating the mechanism. Excessive heat has also been blamed for stopping the clock, including an incident on May 27, 2005, when the clock ceased functioning for nearly 90 minutes. The temperature was referred to by the BBC as unseasonable, having reached 38.1 degrees Celsius, approximately 89 degrees Fahrenheit, which an editor notes,
"So as a Brit, whenever it gets really warm over here, a lot of Americans scoff at the temperatures we declare as being too hot. But I'd just like to point out for a lot of Americans, we don't have air conditioning and our country is not designed for extreme, differentials in heat. Our houses are built to keep the warm in, not out. It gets so hot our roads melt."
The clock resumed working on its own after temperatures cooled somewhat, and though there was no official finding that the incident was heat-related, no other cause was given. It seems that Elizabeth Tower heats unevenly, the side facing the sun rising to higher temperatures than the opposite side, which causes the tower to lean, though not as dramatically as the one famous leaning tower in Pisa, Italy. The lean is evidently sufficient to cause irregularities in the operation of the clock. In 2011, it was reported by a commission formed by Transport of London that the lean is not only permanent but increasing. So who knows, maybe it will rival the Leaning Tower of Pisa one day. According to the study, it may become a problem, though not for at least 4,000 years at the earliest. Not our problem. Mechanical failures have also caused the clock to stop, including an incident in 1976 which caused a stoppage of over 26 days to repair. Stop right there, because one reason for the clock's enviable record of reliability is that official government policy states that any stoppage requiring less than 2 hours to repair is not to be recorded as a stoppage at all. As long as the clock is restored to operation and reset to the correct time in under 2 hours, the clock's reputation for reliability and accuracy is unscathed. In August 2017, the clock was deliberately stopped for a 4-year project aimed at restoring the clock mechanism and the tower in which it is installed. 3 of the 4 dials were restored, and the 4th, its hands powered by a temporary electric motor, continued to display the time of the day. The bells were silenced and remained so until the restored Great Clock again opened to the public in 2022, a year behind schedule. As part of the multi-year renovation, an elevator was installed, meaning visitors no longer had to trudge up the stone staircase to view the clock room and the other sites within Elizabeth Tower. The clock reopened to considerable fanfare in November 2022. The following May, on 2 separate occasions divided by a week, Big Ben failed to sound the hour as expected. Though officials hastily proclaimed the problem had been identified and corrected, one may be tempted to comment that they just don't build them like they used to. Well, I certainly hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, be sure to do all that algorithmic jazz, check the links in the description, and keep it tuned here to Geographics for more videos like this. I'm Eric Malachite, and I'll see you next time, Space Cowboy.